This is Zoe. This is, don't tell me because I got the names. This is Ruby, and this is Roxie. I can remember the names. All right, this is their roadmap to success. Yes, that is not part of the roadmap to success. Down. I'm waiting for you to do what I asked you to do. The more you repeat a command, the less you mean it. This is not going to make for the most exciting footage. Down. Remember, every time you give the dog a treat, they should have the treat go into their mouth first, and then they should hear the command word immediately after. So basically, in this video, we're going to talk about all the little tips and tricks that we went over during the session. Now, Zoe is primarily the dog that we work with the most. She's a puppy. These two are elderly dogs, and they didn't get many treats, so we'll give a couple more treats to them. And so basically, the Guardian is also filming on her phone, so when you hear the country music, that's just a little, that's okay. So basically, she has a couple of, these dogs have a couple of rules. A lot of times when I ask my clients, the dogs have no rules. In this case, the dogs had a couple of rules. They're not allowed to be on the furniture. They have to sit to ask to go outside the door. But they were allowed to be within 7 feet of the humans when they're eating. They were allowed to be in the kitchen when the human's doing her thing. She follows her human everywhere. So we went over a couple of different things to help change what I call the leader-follower dynamic, enforcing rules consistently. My rule is they have to sit before I let them in or out the door. I go to the door, I say sit one time. If the dog doesn't sit, I wait, count to 3, and if they don't sit within 3 seconds, I walk away. Sit down somewhere, grab your phone, grab a magazine, watch a little TV, wait 1 minute, ask Alexa to give you a 60-second timer. After 60 seconds, go back to the door and again, command them to sit. If they don't sit this time, I walk away for 2 minutes, next time for 4 minutes, next time for 8 minutes. But I'm only asking 1 time each time. Does the footage look good? All right. So, all right, so that would be a rule to go outside, but eventually do it with both directions. Other rules, not be allowed in the kitchen. Now, the Guardians may want to put down some painter's tape temporarily. We have a nice, big, spacious, open floor plan, which is great, but it gives the dogs a lot of multiple ways to go. And so if we put down some tape, and one of the things I talk to Guardians about is practicing and recreating situations to help the dog practice it. So before we're cooking, maybe we go down there, we put the tape down so the dogs know where they're not allowed to be. And when I practice this with the dogs one at a time, we have 3 dogs you can see here. These 2 dogs are not so much of a problem because they're older and they've had more time to learn manners. She's just pushing the boundaries, that's part of her job. But it's harder to work with all 3 dogs simultaneously. So for this, I might teach the dog that I want the dog to stay out of the kitchen by helping only 1 dog in the house at a time. I might recreate cooking by grabbing a piece of roast beef, putting it in the microwave for about 20-30 seconds and putting it on the counter, and then pretending like I'm cooking. That's going to cause Zoe to want to come in the kitchen. We use the 3rd escalating consequence, marching directly at her until she gets past the boundary. Then we stop, take 2 steps backwards once she's stationary. Never step backwards if the dog's moving towards you. That's a way of saying I'm giving up this room, this territory for you. So as soon as she's stationary, take 2 steps back. 1 foot, the next foot, and I stop for a 1/4 of a second. If the dog stays in place, I take another 2 steps backwards, and I'm walking away, keeping my front facing the dog. For dogs, remember which your authority goes whatever direction your belly button is pointing. So if I cross the threshold or make the dog walk out of the threshold, and I turn around and go back in the kitchen this way, my authority is pointing this way, the dog will run right up your butt. So the idea is we practice this by helping the dog, by recreating the situation where we're not actually cooking, but the dog smells the food and it thinks it is. And so once the dog learns to, we walk backwards step by step until we get back, and then we pretend like we're cutting cheese or doing whatever the things are. When we get done, then, and the dog lays down like this or sits like this behind the line and they stop challenging you, then I put the roast beef away and then I actually do the real meal. We can do the same sort of situation with eating at the counter, eating at the table. We can do the same sort of situation with practicing at the door. I went through a door cleaning exercise with the Guardian off camera. If you forget how to do that or you need help, message me. I have hundreds of videos of me showing other people how to do it. You can watch other people doing it because we didn't film that for this particular session. Let me see. You're doing such a good job of being here and not being in protesting, so I'll reward that a little bit. I would like the Guardians to carry around treats with them. That means you have the potential to pay off. Now, it doesn't mean that every time the dog does something we want, we pay them with a treat. We can pay them with affection. Now, one thing I always try to do is pet the dog under its chin like I'm showing you here instead of on top of the head. Dogs do not like being patted on top of the head. Being caressed and scratched is okay, but no patting. But when a dog feels good about itself, his nose is parallel to the ground or tilted up. So, and I put a dog in a sit like this. I'll do this with a treat. Sit. And then I pet under the chin. I want the dog used to that. Also, she kind of reacts a little bit when people grab her by the collar. So we can actually sit. Sit. So I can get her used to this sort of motion and associate it with a treat, and maybe actually at grabbing the collar. So I'm breaking it down in individual steps and helping her practice that idea or exercise. But not when she's overexcited, not when I'm trying to actually grab her, just getting her used to it. This is kind of a theme I went through throughout this whole session, is anytime the dog doesn't behave the way that we want, we need to ask ourselves, have we taught the dog the behavior we want them to offer or display in that situation? If we haven't, then it's our responsibility to actually teach the dog how to do it. What I do is I recreate the situation and I really reverse engineer the situation. I break it down in individual steps and help the dog practice one step at a time over and over. Leave it, something we did earlier. Until the dog knows that one step, only then do I go to the next step and then the next step. And I practice each step in the easiest capacity possible. Then, once the dog knows how to do all the individual steps in the easiest capacity, then we start gradually making it more and more difficult and working our way back to a real world situation. Now, she has some real impulse control problems. And so one of the things we went over was the leave it exercise. The first way we taught her is going like this. And as soon as as much as she's trying to take it, she's not going to get it. Then as soon as she stops trying to get it, I'm going to give it to her. She's already forgotten. This has been about an hour ago. Take it. Or excuse me, leave it. Don't say take it. That's a different command. I'm conflating. So I'm going to throw it here. And what we should see is a little bit less force of trying to take it. Leave it. Oh, yes. Now the next step I was actually sit. Come. You got one earlier. So the next step would be we were dropping on the floor. Now at first when I was dropping it, you want to drop it and then kind of cage it as if her head's the deal. We drop it and I'm holding my hand over it if the dog goes for it. But eventually I was dropping it, she was just leaving it. A guardian was getting the same deal. But then she started looking at this hand. She would drop it and leave her hand here and the dog was staring at this hand. So what we did was we dropped one and we had treats in this hand. And we waited for the dog to look up at the human's face. Then they treated with this hand. So they're not getting the treat that we drop on the floor, they're getting the other one. And this is why we teach the leave it exercise. So if we're out somewhere and there's some nasty stuff on the ground that the dog wants to eat, we say leave it, they look up at us, we pass it, and then we give them a reward. We're saying, hey, forgo that one and I'll give you something better. Or hopefully better. We don't know what it was on the sidewalk. But this is a great exercise that will teach the guardians, teach the dog to respect the humans as authority figures, and as well as trying to stop, take, and force things from the guardian. So once the dog will start looking, and we want to wait for the dog to look at us in the face before we give the treat. And once the dog starts looking in the face right away, instead of going for the treat or staring at the treat, then we're going to start elongating it. Then we go, the dog stares at looks up at me, I might wait 2 seconds and give the treat and say, leave it. And then I go to 5 seconds, leave it. And then 15 or 20. So gradually, each dog is going to be different iterations, but eventually get up to the point where the dog is able to leave it for up to a minute or so. Now, when we practice this one, I'd like each of the females in the house to practice this at least twice a day with each female. And when you're doing this, maybe have about 10 treats. So we're not doing a ton. Don't do them back to back. Do one and do them in different locations. But if we practice that, if each the females in the house does it with each dog twice a day, by the end of the week, and we elongate it as I talked about earlier, the dog will have a very strong leave it command. And leave it is different than drop. A lot of people conflate the two. Leave it is don't pick it up in the first place. Drop is drop whatever you have in your mouth at the time. Now we went over a little bit of a drop with her. When she had an object in her mouth, I hold the treat in front of her nose and I wait. As soon as she drops it, I pop the thing in her mouth and I say the word drop. It's important that we shape that on low value items like this pink ball that she's allowed to have at any time. This is not a high value item. But that way when she steals a shoe or something she's not allowed to have, when we say drop it, she's more than happy to do it because we've taught her how to behave in that situation. Let me see, what else? We went over a focus exercise. Now when we do the focus exercise, we'll see if we do a little bit one with her right now. So I'm holding a treat like this between my thumb and forearm. She's going to wear it up. There we go. Yes. And so I'm waiting for her. She's trying to take the treat from me. I'm watching her eyes. And as soon as she looks up to me, I'm going to raise it to my nose because I want to keep her looking at me. Now she's doing what most dogs do normally. They try to take it. That's why I'm holding between my thumb and forefinger and against my knee to prevent her from being able to get to it. She's going to lick it for a little bit, and I'm just watching her eyes. Now, don't make any sounds. I've been talking the whole time so she's not distracted by it, but don't make a sound. There we go. Focus. And as soon as she looks at me in the face, I raise it to my nose to keep her looking at my face, and I go a straight line towards her mouth and say the word focus. Remember, after the treat goes into her mouth. At first, it's 1 second, 1 second. Eventually, it's going to be 1 second, 20 seconds for that second movement before we give her the treat. But you're going to go by 1 second intervals at a time. Now, I'd like the guardians, the female guardians in the house, again, to practice this with probably, really, Zoey needs it more than the other two dogs. So maybe we practice it with these two dogs once a day, and then with Zoey, we try each female in the house tries to practice with her twice a day. Now, first, like I said, it's 1 second, 1 second, and then communicate to everybody else. You know, she was just staring at me the whole time, so I went to 2 seconds on the second movement. That's okay. And eventually, we get to the point where we're all at 20 seconds. Now, try to get to this within a week. After a while, the dog starts getting bored with this exercise, but it's amazing. People are always amazed at how well it works. So your dog starts to look at something else, so you say focus, they stop and look up at you. Now, when we do this, we're going to practice this first in the easiest capacity possible, inside with no one eating, and the room quiet like it is now. Then we want to practice it when we get up to like 5 seconds, 10 seconds, somewhere in that range. Then we're going to practice it with a little bit of distraction. Somebody else is in the house walking through. One of the other dogs might be in the room, but not necessarily free, maybe on the leash at the corner. And we're going to gradually start building in distractions until eventually the dog can do it inside the house no matter what the distractions are. Next stage would be to practice it either in the garage, which is kind of where these guys live, or in the backyard. Probably the garage first, then eventually the backyard. Now when I go to the garage, it's a new environment, so I go back to 1 second, 1 second. But I can move faster at this point because the dog kind of knows what we're doing. And eventually we get to we're in the garage, 1 second, 20 seconds. Then we would do it in the backyard, same sort of deal. And then we want to practice walking around in the garage, which we'll talk about in a minute. And every once in a while when the dog is walking, just say focus, the dog looks up at you, we raise it and start going like this while we're walking. So this way we help the dog practice looking up at the human and waiting for that treat to be delivered while we're walking. This is an important activity. Like I talked about earlier, we're going to break things down to individual steps and help the dog practice it in gradually and progressively more realistic scenarios. So by the time the next step would be actually going on a walk, but without any people nearby. And for no reason whatsoever, we're just going to say focus, the dog looks up at us, as we continue walking, go and give them the treat. This way, when we actually do see someone at the end of the block, we can say focus, the dog looks up at us, and we say turn, and the dog walks away. I taught the dog guardian how to do a turn in the garage. Now, we want to practice the turns and the focus when there's nobody around. If we only practice it when people are around, then she starts recognizing, she says turn, that means that there's danger around, and then she won't want to turn. So again, we need to practice it in easy capacities as much as we can. Now, the guardian asked me in the garage, what do I do if I'm walking and she sees somebody and she starts going crazy? Well, we like to basically not help the dog practice unwanted behaviors. And dogs get better at anything that they do, including aggression or reactivity. I don't think she's an aggressive dog. She hasn't displayed any signs of being aggressive. She's basically, I think, just being protective and possessive of her guardian because she didn't have a lot of rules and structure. Some of the things I went over with to help flip with that, in addition to the rules, would be also petting with a purpose and passive training. Petting with a purpose is not petting the dog when it nudges you like she's going to do right there. So if she sticks her nose under my arm and nudges me, she's telling me what to do. If I pet her when she does that, that tells her that she's the boss of me. But then when she tells me what not to do and I ignore it because I don't even look for it, that stresses her out. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on over here with Zoey. So basically for petting with a purpose is if the dog nudges you or invades your space or whatever, it tells you what to do, nothing happens. Give it a counter order. Sit. Sit. And then I can pet her for an hour or hours after that. She just has to do something to change her state. After a while, what will happen is the dog's going to come start sitting in front of you to prepay for attention. When a dog does that, you're going to pet it and say sit or whatever it is. Now, I have watchwords for both of these things. I say paycheck. If somebody comes in the room and sees that I'm petting her like this, and she's standing, come here, sweetheart. I don't know if you're in the camera shot or not. So I pet her like this, and she's standing, and somebody comes in and says paycheck. Well, then I can say, and if I say, no, I asked you to sit, you didn't see it, well, then we're arguing on our own page, and the dog sees that we're on our own page. So if I'm petting like this, and somebody comes in and says paycheck, I just say stop. I say sit, sit, and then I tell the person, I asked her to sit before you came in the room. She heard you close the door, and she stood up, and I continued petting, and David said it's okay. I'm David, and I say it's okay. So now that after a while, the dog will come start sitting in front of you to prepay for attention. Now, when the dog does that, we want to make sure we recognize and reward that, because a lot of us train our dogs to misbehave. That's when we give them attention. So if the dog starts coming up and sitting in front of you, because that's what we've trained them to do, and we ignore it, they'll go back to jumping up. So when she comes up and sits down on her own, I would pet her and say sit, or come. If she's standing, I pet her and say come. If she's laying down, I pet her and say crash. So we're just going to make sure we recognize and reward the dogs every time they do a desired action or behavior. And this, I use a word for this. I say recognize, reward, or testify. Remember, try to use funny command words whenever possible. So if somebody says a reward to me, I look at her, sit. I'm not going to ask. I'm just going to take that person's word for it that they saw her do something that I missed, and getting the opportunity to pet her for doing it. The more we pet our dogs with a purpose, the more we use passive training, the more the dogs will emulate desired actions and behaviors like sitting, coming, laying down, instead of jumping up on us, barking us, nudging at us, because those are the things now that get attention. But again, we have to teach them to do it. Crash is the word that I use for lay down. They use down. I should sit down. But that's a perfect example. She laid down on her own organically. I didn't ask her to do it. I just petted her and rewarded her for doing it. The more we do this, if we get in a habit of petting with purpose and passive training, every time you pet your dog, it becomes a micro-obedience training session that you do without even thinking about it. So it truly becomes a gift, but everybody in the house has to do it. Let me see, what else? We went over leave it, focus. We went over stay. If you forget how to do the stay, and if I forget to put a link in it, message me and I can either add a link above or I'll send you a link to a video. I teach the stay for the 3 Ds. First for duration, then for distance, then for distraction. I think the guardian forgot to incorporate distraction. I think she was just doing, first just distance. And we have to build, again, the easiest capacity possible. So stay with the dog right there. So stay, stop sign, say stay as you extend your arm, and then put your hand back to your chest and count whatever your count is in your head, and then give the treat and say stay. And then do that again. Now we have 3 dogs here. Each dog should have its own unique release word. I say release, break, freedom, and parole. I have 4 dogs at home. So again, fun command words. I'd also come up with a specific word that means to go outside. That way the guardians can let the dogs out one at a time instead of having them all tear out there. So if I go to the door, I say sit, they sit, and I open the door, they understand they have to wait, and maybe I say back for one, yard for another one, grass for the third one. And so the dog waits for that command word to go outside. Now to teach that, I would have 1 dog at a time inside. Let's say her word is grass. I go to the door, she's already known how to sit, because we've already gone through that, like we talked about earlier. So I open the door and she's sitting, I take the treat, I touch it, and I throw it right outside the door. When she runs out to get it, I would say the word grass when she licked up in her mouth. So after a while, and I taught her yard and hers is back, after a while when I've taught all the dogs separately, then I bring them in and I open the door, they stay seated, and I say grass, and she goes outside because grass means something to her. Grass does not mean anything to them. So after we've done this over and over, again, it's a great way to develop self-control. And that's something else I went over with the guardian, is looking for ways to incorporate self-control and little breaks or interruptions throughout regular day-to-day activities. So the video above, we talked about doing that for the walk, but we're playing tug of war. And every once in a while, stop and ask the dog to sit, or drop, or ask the dog to drop, and then ask the dog to stop for a second. If we're playing fetch, we might ask the dog to sit after it brings us the ball before we pick it up and throw it. Or maybe once it does that, then we sit and we make it wait for 5 seconds, or 10 seconds, or 15. And remember, anytime you're adding time, if the dog has a problem doing it, back up 1 step and practice that previous step a couple more times, and then try to do it again. If your dog doesn't perform well, it's probably because we haven't done a good job teaching it, or we haven't helped them fully practice it. Now that's, the other key mistake is people practice it in the easy capacity, and then they go to the hardest capacity. They don't practice all the shades of gray in between. So anytime your dog fails, back up to an easier iteration and practice it. Let me see what else. The guardians need to make sure that they're eating something before they feed the dogs. I would feed the dogs 1 at a time, because right now she eats and she tries to go next to the older Rottie's name. No, I knew her name. I was trying to think of the breed. And she goes and hangs out next to Ruby or to Roxie's bowl, hoping that Roxie will walk away and she can take some of her food. So I feed my dogs in the order of their rank. I eat something first. Then I give my first dog permission to eat. When he takes his first bite, I say the word chow, chow for him. And that's his command word. Well, the other 3 dogs hear the word chow. There's no food in their mouth, so it doesn't have the same connotation. When he's done eating, he has to leave the area. Then I give the second ranking dog, my 5-year-old, permission. She goes and eats. While she's eating, I say the word grub, and the other 2 dogs are sitting there waiting. When she's done, she has to leave the area. So I'm not letting anybody go and intimidate or try to be next to somebody else to try to get their food or their resource or whatever it is. Also, I'd like the guardians to practice a little bit of coffees for closers, which basically means I'm going to reward the first dog. We have 3 dogs in this house. The guardian goes out of her way to make sure she's being fair to all 3 dogs. While that's great to be fair, it also really penalizes the dog who gave you the best effort. There's no incentive. So what I would do instead for that is pull out 1 treat and say, come. Whoever comes first and sits gets the treat. Whoever comes second and third doesn't get a darn thing. After a while, you get 2 dogs that come at the same time, then they both get a treat, and the 3rd dog doesn't get anything. This creates competition for obedience. Right now, the dogs are competing for attention. And one of the Rotties is laying over here on her back, and so that's a good sign that she's very comfortable here. I think the dogs love and trusted their guardians. I just don't think that they respected, especially the young one, because one of the guardians specifically, because I think she petted at the wrong times. Remember, anything your dog is doing when you pet it is what you're reinforcing. So if it's nervous, anxious, fearful, or excited when we pet it, we're going to make it more nervous, excited, or fearful. Now, if the dog's nervous, I can lay my hand on the dog and let it know I'm here with you without amplifying it. Let me see. I'd like the guardians to not walk around the dogs. If the dogs are standing, walk through the dogs if it's not even there. If it's sitting or lying down, you can step over and walk around. But if we walk around the dog, that's a way of signifying or telling the dog, you have more authority than me. I'm walking around you so you don't have to do it. So if the dogs are in your way, walk through them so they learn to adopt that follower's mindset. Let me see. We talked a little bit about the door claiming exercise. Message me if you have questions about that. I'll talk a little bit more about loose leash training. Practicing in the garage would be great. And there are things we could do to put our dog in a position to succeed. Since she's such a high energy dog, we can use a doggy backpack, fill it up with bottles of water or bags of sand. That gives her something to do on the walk, which is going to keep her focused, but also the extra weight is going to make it a more efficient workout. The other thing we can do is take her outside and play fetch. Play fetch for a little while first, then let her come inside, let her calm down so she's no longer breathing heavy. Then we go out in the garage, we practice the leashing up exercise that I just showed in the video above. And once she's leashed up, then we practice the technique of anytime that she gets back to the end of the leash, we stop, wait for her to come back. And again, I would use a treat, lure her into position. Her position was on the left, so I'd lure her this way so the dog's walking this way, and then I get her to do a turn. And so she's facing this way, and I raise it up to put her in a sit, pop it in her mouth, come up with a word that means go into this position, like position, place, attention, not come or heel, but a word that means specifically, what we want her to learn is as soon as I get to the end of the leash and it gets taught, if I turn around, come back to the human and sit, I get a reward. And after a while, that becomes an autonomous behavior. And it takes a lot of practice. Practicing in the garage is great because there's no squirrels, rabbits, other dogs, birds, sights, sounds, smells. We want to, again, help the dog practice the behavior in the easiest situation possible, then gradually more and more difficult situations. So after we practice the returning every time the leash gets tense, then the guardian might actually put down some cones or something around the garage and practice walking a little bit of a circuit. And stop every once in a while, stop, ask her to sit. When she sits, pop the treat in her mouth, say the word sit, then take another couple steps, stop again. So we're going to build these throughout so that she just gets used to, after a while, instead of walking around looking for what I'm getting into, she's walking around looking to see where the human's feet are, because if the human stops and I sit, I'm going to get a treat. Now, the guardian did that a lot on the walk, but probably when the dog was above threshold or distracted with other things. Again, practicing in the easiest capacity possible. And then after we practice these things, then we're ready to go for a walk. So by the time we actually go for a walk, we practice staying calm during the leashing process, staying behind the human on the way there, sitting down and waiting for the human to attach the leash, then practicing not pulling on the leash, then practicing walking and sitting in the garage, and then we actually go for a walk. But remember, I also would like the guardian to practice leashing her up 5 times for every 1 time that she goes for a walk for the next 2 or 3 weeks. After a while, you go through it, she's like, oh, it's another drill. And preferably where we practice a little bit of the walking around in the garage and the loose leash and all the rest of that stuff. But the first stage is she has to stay behind you as you're walking there. Second stage is she has to stay seated while you attach the leash. And those are going to take a lot of back and forth practices. So make sure you practice it at times when you're not actually taking her for a walk, so you take away all your emotional baggage and you're not worried about it. You're just simply practicing this to help her understand and establish the correct behavior. Let me see. I'm probably forgetting some other things. We filmed a lot here. But if the guardian has any questions, make sure you call me or text me. If I don't hear from my clients, I assume that means everything's going great. So make sure that you call or text me if you have questions. It's pretty common to need to make a little adjustments. You usually do with text messages or quick phone calls. But if you have questions after the fact, I don't care if it's 7 years after the session, I want you to text me. So program my number in your phone And text me is the fastest way to reach me. If I'm on the road and I don't recognize the number, I won't get back to it for a couple days. But a text, especially if you text me a picture of the dog. Hey, this is Zoe. You worked with us on impulse control. I had a question about this. I'll fire you off and answer right away. Okay, well, this is Zoe, Ruby, and Roxie's Roadmap to Success. Remember, everything you do trains your dog. Only sometimes you mean it.